5,000 American soldiers. They survived Hitler's prison camps. They walked across half of Europe to reach the Red Army lines. They thought they were going home. Most of them never did. This is the part of the Second World War the history books in your high school did not teach you. After the German surrender, after the parades, after the kisses in Times Square, after the telegrams went out to American mothers saying, "Your son is coming home," thousands of those sons quietly disappeared into Soviet hands. And the man who tried hardest to bring them back was the same man who had broken the German army at Bastogne. General George Smith Patton Jr., 60 years old, 4 stars on his collar, the most famous soldier in America. He had the names. He had the camps, he had the trucks. What he did not have was permission. What he did next would cost him his command. 3 months later, on a wet road in Germany, it would cost him his life. And the question he was about to raise, the question of what America owes the men it sends to war, has never been formally answered by his country. This is the story of the prisoners we left behind, and the only general who refused to let them go quietly. 800 miles north of Odessa, in the spring of 1945, inside the American embassy in Moscow, Ambassador Avril Harriman was hunched over a typewriter. 53 years old. He had not slept properly in weeks. He was drafting a cable to Washington. The truth he could not quite write out loud was this: the Soviets were not letting our men come home. 2 months earlier, 3 men had stood on a balcony at Yalta. Franklin Roosevelt, frail and dying, Winston Churchill, gripping a cigar, Joseph Stalin, 66 years old, eyes flat as winter ice. They signed an agreement. Article 3, all prisoners of war liberated by Allied forces would be returned to their country of origin, rapidly, the document said. Not eventually, not when convenient, rapidly. They shook hands, they smiled for the cameras. Roosevelt would be dead within 2 months. Churchill would be voted out of office within 5. Stalin would outlive them both, and he would break the promise before the ink had dried. By the spring of 1945, the Red Army was sweeping west through Poland. They overran German prison camps, Stalag Luft 4, Oflag 64 at Shubin, Stalag 3C at Alt-Druitz. Inside those camps were thousands of American airmen and infantrymen who had spent months, some of them years, behind German wire. They expected liberation to mean a truck ride to American lines, a hot meal, a telegram home. Instead, they were marched east, deeper into Soviet-held territory, deeper into silence. Hundreds of miles to the west, in a requisitioned villa in Bad Tölz, Bavaria, a man with 4 stars on his collar was reading a casualty report and grinding his teeth. George Smith Patton Jr. He would turn 60 that November, promoted to 4-star general on the 14th of April. The star he had wanted his entire life had come to him at the exact moment the war he loved was ending. He had ridden the Third Army from the beaches of Normandy, across France, across the Rhine, across the heart of Germany. By April 1945, his tanks were inside Czechoslovakia. 60 miles from Prague, a radio order arrived from Supreme Headquarters: halt. Do not enter Prague. The city had been promised to the Soviets. Patton read the order twice. He looked at his map. He looked at the distance to the city, close enough to smell the smoke. Then he obeyed. He always obeyed. But that night he wrote in his diary that he had been tied hand and foot for political reasons. He used a word for politicians that does not bear repeating here. He had a feeling, even then, a feeling he could not yet prove, that the war his men were dying to win was already being lost, somewhere far above his pay grade. But this was not the first time Patton had stared at a map and made a decision that history would not forget. 1 month earlier, late March 1945, he had done something he would never quite admit to. His Third Army had crossed the Rhine. His tanks were rolling east at a speed that astonished even the Germans. Intelligence reported a prisoner of war camp at Hamillberg, 50 miles behind the German front line. Inside that camp were American officers, perhaps several hundred, perhaps more. On the night of March 25th, Patton summoned a young captain to his command post. Captain Abraham Baum, 24 years old, a red-haired Jewish kid from the Bronx who before the war had cut patterns for women's blouses on 7th Avenue. He was now one of the finest tank officers in the 4th Armored Division. Patton told Baum he was going to lead a task force 50 miles behind enemy lines. 307 men, 16 tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, self-propelled guns, a column with no air cover, no resupply, no reinforcements. No realistic plan to get home. Patton clapped him on the shoulder. He said it like a promise. "Pull this off, Abe, and I will see you get the Medal of Honor." Baum's reply, recorded by witnesses, was simpler. "I have my orders, sir." You don't have to bribe me. What Baum did not know, what no one in the column knew except one man, was the real reason he was being sent. The man riding in the lead half-track in clean fatigues was Major Alexander Stiller, Patton's personal aide, a former Texas Ranger. Stiller's only job on the mission was to identify one specific prisoner inside that camp, a lieutenant colonel, 38 years old. West Point graduate, captured in Tunisia in February 1943 after the disaster at Sidi Bou Zid. His name was John Knight Waters, and he was married to George Patton's daughter. Task Force Baum set out at dusk on March 26th. They smashed through the German front line in the dark. They drove all night, all the next day. They reached Hamillberg on the evening of March 27th. They breached the wire. They liberated more than 1,500 Allied prisoners, but they could not bring them home. There were not enough vehicles. There was not enough fuel. The Germans had been alerted hours earlier. By dawn on the 28th, German tanks and Panzerfaust teams had encircled the column. Baum tried to break out. He failed. 32 Americans were killed. 256 more were wounded or captured. Of the 307 men who set out, only 15 reached American lines on the day of the breakout. The final tally, after weeks of escapes and liberations, would be 35. The rest, including Captain Baum himself, shot in the groin while trying to escape into the forest, were taken prisoner by the very army they had come to defeat. Lieutenant Colonel Waters, the man Patton had sent them to find, had been shot during the chaos of the breakout. He survived. He was eventually liberated 2 weeks later when the regular American army reached Hamillberg in force. When Patton was asked years later why he had sent 300 men to rescue one prisoner, he said this: "I know of no error I made except that of failing to send a combat command to take Hamillberg. The only thing he regretted was not sending more." Weeks later, when Captain Baum was recovering from his wound in an army hospital, he finally saw Patton again. He asked the general the question directly. "It is difficult for me to believe, sir, that you would have sent us on that mission to rescue just one man." Patton looked at him for a long moment. Then he said it quietly, without apology. "That's right, Abe, I wouldn't have." Remember that exchange, because in 3 months, when thousands of American prisoners begin to vanish into Soviet hands, this is the only precedent history has for what George Patton was willing to do for the men under his command, and the lengths he was willing to deceive to do it. By the first week of May 1945, the war in Europe was effectively over. Hitler was dead in his bunker. Berlin was a smoking ruin. The Wehrmacht was surrendering in pieces along the Elbe in Italy, in Bavaria. Across the Soviet sector, Red Army units rolled through emptied German prison camps. They counted the survivors, American airmen from Stalag Luft 4, American infantrymen from Oflag 64, British paratroopers who had been captured at Arnhem, French foreign legionnaires, South Africans, Australians. The agreement said they would be returned to their countries promptly. What happened instead? The men remembered it the same way. Soviet soldiers stripped them of watches, rings, fountain pens, anything of value. They were given black bread and watery soup. They were told to wait. They waited days, then weeks. They were marched, not west, but east. Some ended up in former Wehrmacht barracks. Some ended up in former forced labor compounds. Some ended up in places nobody could name afterward. The men who escaped, who walked west on their own across hundreds of miles of devastated countryside, brought the same story to American intelligence officers when they finally crossed the line. They had been freed, and then they had been imprisoned again. In Moscow, the man assigned to fix this problem was a 49-year-old American Major General named John Russell Dean. Dean was not a celebrity general. He was the head of the United States military mission in Moscow, a thankless job that meant trying to coordinate Allied strategy with a Soviet government that did not, in any meaningful sense, want to be coordinated. He had been in Moscow since 1943. He had watched his faith in the Soviet alliance erode, month by month, like ice retreating from a riverbank. In February 1945, 3 escaped American officers reached his office. They were ragged, they were exhausted. They told him about the camps, about the marches east, about the wire that had simply changed flags. Dean went to the Soviet authorities. He requested a formal meeting with the man responsible for Allied prisoner repatriation. He was granted an interview with Colonel General Konstantin Dmitrievich Golubev, 49 years old, veteran of Stalingrad, head of the Soviet Repatriation Administration. Dean brought a list, names, units, camp locations. Golubev listened. He smoked. He waited until Dean finished. Then he said it. In essence, in tone, in policy, there would be no organized return of American prisoners. Not until every Soviet citizen in Western hands, every single one, regardless of whether they wished to come back, regardless of whether they would be shot the moment they stepped off the boat, had been delivered into Soviet custody. It was not a request, it was a statement. The prisoners were leverage. The men in those camps, Americans, Britons, Frenchmen, were hostages. In a transaction Stalin had already decided he was going to win. Dean wrote a furious report to Washington. He recommended a tougher line. Washington filed his report and asked him to soften his tone. On the 22nd of May 1945, 2 weeks after the German surrender, American and Soviet officers met at the city of Halle in central Germany to sign a formal repatriation agreement. The document committed both sides to exchange liberated prisoners on a reciprocal basis. The Americans began handing over Soviet citizens almost immediately. By the end of June, hundreds of thousands had been transferred east. Many of them were not soldiers. Many of them did not want to go. Many of them would never be heard from again. The Soviets did not reciprocate at the same speed. They claimed they were processing. They said it took time. They cited records that did not match the records the Americans had. The men were still in the camps, and the men were still disappearing. In July 1945, George Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria. It was meant to be an honor. It was meant to put a famous warrior in charge of a peaceful occupation. He sat in his office and read the reports. Liberated Americans, last seen in Soviet hands, status unknown. The intelligence estimates fluctuated month to month. Some put the number at 3,000, some as high as 5,000. The exact figure would never be settled in his lifetime. To this day, the Joint United States and Russian Federation Commission, established in 1992 to find these men, has not closed the file. He had no authority to cross into the Soviet zone. He had no authority to demand their return. He could write letters. He could ask politely. He could wait. For a man who had once sent 307 soldiers 50 miles behind enemy lines for the sake of one prisoner, this was not a peace he could live with. The first 6 months after the war did not feel, to George Patton, like peace at all. They felt like the beginning of the next war. And he was one of the only men in the room who could see it coming. The summer of 1945 should have been a season of joy. The flags came down from the cathedrals in Bavaria. The American soldiers in the streets of Munich were sunburned and grinning. They were going home. George Patton sat at a desk in a villa in Bad Tölz, reading reports that nobody else seemed willing to read. Outside his window, the Alps. Inside the folder on his desk, the slow and quiet betrayal of what the war had supposedly been about. The agreement signed at Yalta had a clause buried in it that the American public had never been told about. It said this: Soviet citizens in Allied hands would be returned to Soviet authority, all of them, soldiers who had been forced to fight for the Germans. Civilians swept up by the chaos of the Eastern Front, refugees who had fled Stalin a decade before the war even started. White Russians who had never been Soviet citizens in their lives, all of them, regardless of whether they wanted to go. The operation would later acquire a code name, Keelhaul. By the time the official paperwork was finalized, in the summer of 1946, more than 2 million human beings had been put on trains and trucks and ships and delivered, against their will, into the hands of the Soviet state. But the work began in the summer of 1945, and the men who carried it out did not forget what they saw. At the port of Murmansk, on the cold edge of the Arctic, a British naval officer recorded what happened when the first transports arrived. The Soviet citizens were marched down the gangplanks under guard. The British escort officers were ordered to remain on the ship. The prisoners disappeared into a long shed at the end of the dock. A few minutes later, the officers heard the sound of automatic weapons fire. Then silence, then the sound of trucks, then more silence. The British officers were given vodka and a meal. They were told the prisoners had been processed. They were sent back to England. They wrote what they had heard in their diaries. The diaries were classified for 50 years. In late May of 1945, in a quiet valley in the Austrian Alps, the same betrayal unfolded in front of British and American troops who could not look away. The town was called Lienz. Camped in the meadows along the Drava River were tens of thousands of Cossacks, men, women, children. Old soldiers who had fought for the Tsar in the First World War, their wives, their grandchildren. They had cast their lot with the Germans because they hate Stalin more than they hated Hitler. Now Germany had lost, and they were stranded in the West, terrified. The British commanders told them they would not be sent back. The Cossacks believed them. Then the orders came down from Yalta. On the first day of June 1945, British soldiers with rifle butts and bayonets began herding the Cossacks toward waiting trucks. The Cossacks understood in that moment what was happening. An Orthodox priest stood at the front of the crowd with his cross held high, singing the psalms. British soldiers clubbed him to the ground. Mothers ran toward the river with their babies in their arms and threw themselves into the current rather than be loaded onto the trucks. Old men hanged themselves from the pine trees in the meadow. One man crushed the skulls of his wife and 3 children with a rock, then took his own life with the same stone. The British soldiers carrying out the operation wept openly. Many of them never spoke of it again. The American officers who heard the reports, Patton among them, understood for the first time exactly what kind of partner the United States had welcomed into the family of nations. Back in Bavaria, Patton did what he could, which was almost nothing. His sector of southern Germany was filling up with refugees from the east. Polish people, Hungarian people, Ukrainians, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Cossacks who had escaped Lienz, Volga Germans who had been deported by Stalin in 1941. All families with nothing left to lose, walking west, sleeping in barns, eating from American mess kits. The orders from above were clear. Identify Soviet citizens among the displaced persons, sort them, hand them over. Patton dragged his feet. He gave vague instructions to his staff. He let papers sit on his desk for weeks. He routed refugees away from the screening stations. He did, in his own quiet and stubborn way, what he could to keep these people alive. His superiors noticed. They were not pleased, and the reports about American prisoners kept coming. An American sergeant who had walked 400 miles from a camp near Lodz. A pilot who had bribed his way out of a holding facility near Brest-Litovsk. A bombardier who had stowed away on a freighter at Odessa. They arrived at American checkpoints with the same story. Watches gone, wedding rings gone, wallets emptied, marched east, not west. Held in former German barracks, sometimes for weeks. Some men, they said, had not been allowed to leave at all. Patton read each report. He underlined the names. In the privacy of his diary, the diary that would not be published in full until 1974, 29 years after his death, he wrote down what he actually thought. What he wrote, no other American general of his rank had put on paper quite this bluntly. He wrote that the United States had backed the wrong horse, that the Russians had no regard for human life, that they were our chronic enemies, and that we had, these are his words, paraphrased only slightly, defeated the wrong nation. The Western Allies, he believed, had won the war so completely they had created a vacuum, and the Soviets were flooding into that vacuum at a rate the Americans could not match. He wrote that the German Wehrmacht, the army his Third Army had crushed only months before, could and should be rearmed. He wrote that 2 of the surrendered German divisions, combined with 1 Hungarian division of anti-Soviet veterans, could form the core of a defensive line against the Red Army. And in August of 1945, he wrote the sentence that, if it had ever been published in his lifetime, would have ended his career on the spot. "If we have to fight them," he wrote of the Soviets, "now is the time. From now on we will get weaker and they will get stronger." He was, to put it plainly, advocating a third world war against the country that had just lost 27 million people fighting on the same side as the United States. He was one of the very few senior American officers to put such thoughts on paper. Others, Admiral Leahy, General Clay, shared the suspicion. None said it with the volume Patton did. His friends, when they saw him at dinners and receptions in Bavaria that summer, said he had changed, that he was drinking more, sleeping less, talking to himself when he thought no one was listening. The war had been everything to him. And now the war was over, and the peace in his mind was already worse than the fighting had been. He wrote to his wife Beatrice almost every day. Beatrice was 59 years old. She lived at their estate in South Hamilton, Massachusetts. She had been married to him for 35 years. She had learned over those years to read between the lines of his letters. In a letter dated the 21st of July 1945, he described what Soviet soldiers had done in Berlin after the city's surrender. He had walked through the wreckage himself earlier that same month at the invitation of Marshal Zhukov. What he wrote to her was not fit for a newspaper. He described the systematic rape of German women across the city, the murders, the looting. He told her, using language meant only for her, that the people who had committed these acts were not allies. They were not friends. They were a new enemy, and the United States, in its eagerness to celebrate victory, was refusing to see them. What Patton was writing to his wife in the summer of 1945 was the same warning Winston Churchill would deliver to the world from a podium in Missouri the following March. But Patton had said it first, in private, in letters, in his diary, to anyone who would listen. By August of 1945, the most decorated armored commander in the United States Army was a man with a four-star general's collar and a head full of thoughts that in 1945 America were close to treason. The crisis came on the 22nd of September. Patton was at his headquarters in Bad Tölz. He was hosting a press conference. American reporters had been pressing him about the policy of denazification, the program to remove former members of the Nazi Party from civil service and government positions throughout the American occupation zone. Patton was tired. He was frustrated. He believed, with some justification, that the policy was being applied so broadly that it was making Bavaria impossible to govern. Every postmaster, every railway clerk, every electrician had been required to join the party under Hitler. To purge them all was to shut down the lights, the trains, the water, the bread. He tried to explain this, and then, in front of a room full of American journalists, he made a comparison that he would not survive politically. He said that membership in the Nazi Party for many ordinary Germans had been a matter of professional necessity. The same way, he said, that a man in the United States might register as a Democrat or a Republican in order to keep his job in a particular city. He said it offhand. He said it the way old soldiers say things when they have been talking too long. He did not mean what some of the reporters in the room thought he meant, but what he said was, the Nazis were like Democrats and Republicans. The wire services carried it across the Atlantic that night. By the next morning, every major newspaper in America was running it on the front page. The wife of the late President Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, still the conscience of liberal America, called for Patton's removal. Jewish congressmen demanded his resignation. Veterans groups condemned him. Editorial pages that had celebrated him as the conqueror of the Third Reich 6 months earlier now described him as a man who did not understand what he had been fighting against. On the 28th of September, a telegram arrived at Bad Tölz. Patton was summoned to Frankfurt. He flew there the same day. He walked into the office of Dwight David Eisenhower. 55 years old, his old friend, his commander, his rival, his protector for almost 3 years of war. They had shared cigars at dawn before North Africa. They had argued about strategy on the eve of D-Day. They had stood together at Bastogne in the snow. Eisenhower did not waste words. He told Patton that he was being relieved as military governor of Bavaria. The decision had already been made. It would be announced that afternoon. Patton stood at attention. He saluted. He said nothing, but he left Frankfurt that day a different man. Not broken, Not silent, something more dangerous than that. He was a man with nothing left to lose. In the days that followed, he did not go quietly into retirement. He wrote letters to his wife, to his old West Point classmates, to friends in Washington. He wrote them in his own hand in his sharp angular script, and he did not soften what he had to say. He believed the Soviet Union was building an empire in Eastern Europe while America watched. He believed the prisoner of war crisis was only the most visible symptom of a much larger disease. He believed the men who had been left behind in Soviet hands had been abandoned by their government for the sake of a peace that was already a lie. And he wrote, in a letter that survives today in the Patton papers at the Library of Congress, that when he returned to the United States when he was a private citizen, no longer bound by the uniform he had worn for 36 years, there would be things he intended to say. He did not say exactly what. He did not need to. On the 7th of October 1945, he was also relieved of command of the Third Army. The army he had built, the army that had crossed France and the Rhine and half of Germany, the army that, in 11 months of combat, had killed or captured more enemy soldiers than any other field army are in American history. It was given to a man named Lucian Truscott, a good general, a capable general, but not Patton. Patton was assigned instead to command the 15th United States Army. The 15th Army was, in plain English, a desk. It existed to write the official history of the war in Europe. It had no combat troops. It had no operational mission. It was a holding pattern for senior officers who could not yet be allowed to retire, but who could no longer be trusted with anything that mattered. He took command of it on the 8th of October. He moved his headquarters to Bad Nauheim, north of Frankfurt. He set about, with characteristic energy, organizing the writing of the war's history. He drove his historians hard. 3 months before his arrival, 10 of 137 required reports had been completed. 3 months after his arrival, all 137 were finished. It was, by his own standards, a victory. But it was the kind of victory that comes to a man who has been told his real work is done. In late November, he began to make plans for a trip home. The official reason was Christmas leave. The real reason, known only to Beatrice, to his daughters, to a small handful of close friends, was that he was not going to come back. He intended to retire. He intended to take off the uniform for good. And he intended, once he was a private citizen of the United States of America, to say what he had been forbidden to say in uniform. He scheduled his departure for the 10th of December. A military aircraft would carry him from Bad Nauheim to Paris. From Paris he would fly to New York. From New York he would take a train to Massachusetts, to his wife, to his home, to whatever came next. On the evening of the 8th of December, his chief of staff sat across from him at dinner. Major General Hobart Gay, 51 years old. Everyone called him Hap. He had served with Patton since North Africa. He had been beside him through every major campaign in the European theatre. He was one of the few men Patton trusted completely. Gay knew his commander was leaving. He knew it might be the last weekend they ever spent together. He suggested they go hunting in the morning. Pheasants. There was good country south of Mannheim, along the Rhine. They could leave early, drive down, spend a few hours in the field, be back before dark. Patton looked at him across the table. He thought about it. He nodded. He said he would like that very much. The hunting trip was scheduled for the 9th of December. The flight home was scheduled for the 10th. The general had 1 day left. The morning of December 9th, 1945, was cold and grey, a Sunday morning, the kind of morning that arrives without ceremony. At Bad Nauheim, north of Frankfurt, 2 men climbed into the back seat of a 1938 Cadillac Model 75 limousine. George Patton, 60 years old, in a green wool overcoat over his Class A uniform, Major General Hap Gay, 51, beside him. Between them on the seat lay 2 shotguns and a small picnic basket. Behind the wheel was Private First Class Horace Lewis Woodring, 19 years old, a farm boy from Kentucky who had enlisted at 17 and ended up, by an accident of paperwork and military fortune, as the personal driver of the most famous general in the United States Army. The drive south would take about 2 hours. They were headed to a hunting reserve near Speyer on the west bank of the Rhine. Pheasants, a quiet morning in the field, a late lunch, back to Bad Nauheim before dark. Patton was scheduled to fly home the next day. The roads through the American occupation zone were busy that morning. Convoys of supply trucks, jeeps full of military police, civilians on bicycles, children walking to church. The wreckage of the war was everywhere. Gutted buildings, twisted signposts, the burned husks of vehicles that nobody had bothered to clear. Just after 11:45 in the morning, the Cadillac was approaching a railroad crossing on Highway 38, just north of Mannheim, in a place called Keffertal. Coming from the opposite direction was a 2.5-ton GMC truck. It belonged to a quartermaster depot. Its driver was a young technician 5th grade named Robert Lee Thompson. He was 20 years old. According to the surviving Army accident summary, he was returning from a depot in Mannheim. According to later researchers, and there are no official records left to settle the question, exactly why he was on that particular road at that particular hour was never fully explained. Thompson did not see the Cadillac in time, or he saw it and misjudged the distance, or something else happened that no investigation would ever fully explain. He turned left across the highway. Woodring saw it coming. He hit the brakes. He pulled the wheel to the right. It was not enough. The Cadillac and the truck collided at the front right corner, a low-speed crash, the kind of accident a city sees 100 times a day. The truck barely moved. Its heavy front bumper crumpled the Cadillac's grille and folded the right front fender like cardboard. Glass shattered. Both vehicles came to a stop. In the front seat, Woodring sat blinking, his nose bleeding from where he had struck the steering wheel. A few small cuts on his forehead, otherwise unhurt. Behind him, Hap Gay had been thrown forward against the back of the front seat. Bruised, shaken, otherwise unhurt, but the third man in the car was not moving. George Patton was slumped against the partition that separated the front and back seats of the Cadillac. His head was bowed forward at an angle that did not look right. There was blood on his forehead and on the upholstery. He was conscious, he could speak, his eyes were open, but he could not move his arms, he could not move his legs. He could feel nothing below his neck. He looked at Gay, and he said the words that the men who heard them would remember for the rest of their lives. "I think I'm paralyzed." Then a few seconds later, calmly, almost matter-of-factly, "This is a hell of a way for a soldier to die." The military ambulance arrived 20 minutes later. The medics moved with the care of men who understood immediately what they were looking at. A general officer, a broken neck, a spinal cord injury at the 3rd and 4th cervical vertebrae, almost certainly fatal. Almost certainly soon. They drove him, not to Mannheim, but south to Heidelberg, to the 130th Station Hospital, the best American medical facility in the European theatre. They put him in a private room on the 2nd floor. Beatrice Patton was in South Hamilton, Massachusetts, when the cable arrived. She was 59 years old. They had been married for 35 years. She had spent 2/3 of her marriage waiting for him to come home from one war or another, and she had learned the language of military telegrams the way other women learn cookbooks. She read the cable. She did not weep. She picked up the telephone and arranged her travel. Within 36 hours she was on a military transport bound for Frankfurt. She arrived at the hospital on the evening of December 11. She walked into his room and sat down next to the bed and took his hand. He could not feel her fingers in his, but he could see her face, he could hear her voice. For 12 days she sat with him. The doctors did what they could. They put him in skeletal traction. They tried to relieve the pressure on his spinal cord. They watched him for the complications that always come with injuries of that kind in the 2nd week. He was lucid almost the entire time. He spoke with Beatrice. He spoke with the doctors. He spoke with the chaplain who came to see him. He spoke with his old friend Jeffrey Keyes, who flew in from Vienna to say goodbye. He did not complain. He did not rage. He told one of his nurses, a young woman named Anne Menzick, that he had made his peace. On the afternoon of December 21, 1945, a Friday, a blood clot moved from his lung to his heart. The doctors had been watching for it. They could not stop it. He died at 5:55 in the evening. Beatrice was sitting beside him. She was holding his hand when he stopped breathing. He was 60 years old. By his own request, recorded in his will, he was not sent home. He was buried with his men. On Christmas Eve, December 24, 1945, in a driving rain, his coffin was lowered into the ground at the Luxembourg American Cemetery and Memorial in the village of Ham. 5,000 soldiers of his Third Army were buried in the same cemetery, the men he had led from Normandy to the Czech border. The men he had loved more, perhaps, than he had loved anyone except his wife. His grave is the simplest in the cemetery. A plain white marble cross, no different from the crosses around it. That is the story the official records tell. But there is another story, and no one has ever been able to prove it or disprove it, so it is fair, here at the end, to tell it the way history actually leaves it. As a question. The truck driver, Robert Thompson, was never properly investigated. He was never charged. Some accounts say he was hustled out of Germany within 72 hours of the accident. His military records, in the years after, became unusually difficult to locate. Researchers in the 1980s and 1990s who tried to find him often could not. The accident report itself, the official military police investigation of the crash that killed an American four-star general, was never released to the public. According to multiple investigations, including a 2008 inquiry by the journalist Robert Wilcox in his book Target, Patton, the original report cannot be found. It is not in the National Archives, it is not in the records of the Provost Marshal General, it is not, so far as anyone can determine, anywhere. Wilcox's book also contained a stranger claim. He interviewed an elderly former officer of the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor to the CIA. The man's name was Douglas Beatatrice. Beatatrice claimed, in conversations recorded before his death in 1999, that he had been hired by William Donovan, the head of the OS, to arrange Patton's death. Beatatrice said the accident had been staged. He said Patton had survived the crash itself. He said the general had been killed in the hospital by a poison administered to look like a pulmonary embolism. Beatatrice had no documents. He produced no corroboration. He was, in the judgment of most serious historians, an unreliable source telling an old man's story. The young driver, Horace Woodring, lived until 2003. He gave interviews over the years. He always insisted the accident was an accident. He told one reporter, late in his life, that he believed another vehicle had been on the road that morning, a second Jeep, parked oddly, that he had noticed in the corner of his eye just before the collision. He could not be certain. He had been 19. It had happened very fast. The mainstream historical consensus, then and now, is that the death of George Patton was exactly what it appeared to be. A freak collision on a wet road, a bad angle, a broken neck, a great man dying small the way ordinary men die on an ordinary Sunday morning. Most historians believe that, but the file is still missing, and the questions are still there. And the man who would have made the loudest noise about the prisoners left behind in Soviet hands, the man who had been weeks away from taking off the uniform and walking into a microphone in the United States of America, that man was buried in a cemetery in Luxembourg before he ever got the chance to say what he had to say. 3 months later, in March of 1946, Winston Churchill stood at a podium in Fulton, Missouri, and used the phrase that George Patton had been writing in private letters for almost a year. An iron curtain, Churchill said, had descended across the continent. In 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, President Boris Yeltsin of the Russian Federation publicly acknowledged that American prisoners from the Korean War had been held in Soviet camps and never returned. The acknowledgement was specific to Korea, but the door it opened reached further back. Researchers began to find the names of American soldiers from World War II in old NKVD files. Men who had been listed as missing in action since 1945, men whose families had waited all their lives for an answer. The United States and the Russian Federation established a joint commission on prisoners of war and missing in action. It was created to find these men, to name them, to bring whatever was left of them home. The commission still exists today. 81 years after the end of the war, it is still working. It has produced reports, it has identified some remains, it has not in any final sense closed the file. George Patton did not save those prisoners. He did not lead a covert raid into Soviet territory. He did not face down Stalin with American tanks. The Hollywood version of his last 6 months is a fantasy. The truth is harder and quieter and sadder than that. The truth is that he saw what was happening. He saw it earlier than most. He understood it more bluntly than any other senior commander dared to say out loud. He tried to put it on the record. He was told to be patient. He was told to be quiet. He was told that the alliance mattered more than the men. And then he was buried with the men. The question he raised in the autumn of 1945 has never been formally answered by the country he served. So we leave it here at the end in the form he left it. Who did we leave behind to keep a peace that was already a lie? And how do we live with the answer?